So welcome to the February 29th Leap Day meeting of the Richmond and Hinesburg Police Governance Committee. My name is Jay Furr. I'm chair of the Richmond Select Board, and we have with us today Marilee and Maggie from the Hinesburg Select Board, and Bard from our Select Board, also Anthony Cambridge, Todd Oda, Hinesburg Town Manager, and Josh Arneson, Richmond Town Manager. Is there any public comment from anybody on a topic that's not on the agenda? Seeing none, are there any additions or deletions to the agenda beyond, I don't know if everybody had a chance to look at the agenda. There's two items: review of the relationship and discussion of hiring a facilitator. Is there anything else that should be on the agenda that is not? Seeing none, then we can get right on into our agenda. Our first bullet point is a review of the ongoing contractual relationship for police and chief services, including length of contract. And I would pass the ball on that to Todd and to Josh.
Pretty much goes through close to the end of the fiscal year, I believe. I don't remember the exact date. It's not.
Yeah, that's
specific.
my memory too,
The
which
two-
would be June 30th.
Yeah, the two separate contracts. You know, from my perspective, I think it's going fine. I'm not that involved in it, but you know, I think it's probably more at the Josh's end, and you know, as things stand now,
Right.
the Richmond community, because you know, Hinesburg's providing all the service.
Right. I know when we had our last meeting like this, we talked about budget cost certainty.
Yeah.
Because it's very difficult for you to do a budget if you don't know that we might just, I don't know, contract with Bolton.
Right. Yeah.
And I was amenable at the time to making it a longer contract
Yeah.
for that purpose. And also, you know, just gives us security too, that you wouldn't just abruptly say, no, we don't want to do it.
Yeah. I mean, my thinking is that it seems like we will continue with, you know, sharing with the chief. And then what really comes into play is how the arrangement is structured once there's a few
Richmond officers, right?
That really seems to be, that's going to be the nut to crack, I think.
Yeah, and that's something that is a topic of union negotiation, obviously, on our end. We don't really know why the union would object, but the negotiations are ongoing, and I guess we can't really talk about what's been discussed so far, but that is a subject that's been brought up.
So from my perspective, we're approaching this the right way, which is two related parts about chief and police services. For those of you who are not as close a student of the Richmond town budget as the three of us are, we budgeted next year for essentially half-time contracting for chief services. So that's like status quo. And ostensibly, if the budget passes next year, we could entertain a discussion of a contract that then would extend through the next fiscal year as well, right? That's probably the easy one. And then police services, we budgeted 4 positions in the proposed budget. If that passes, between that and the collective bargaining agreement, which, to be clear, we have one and we're currently in collective bargaining with the union. You won't be surprised to hear that they're not interested in contracting out all the police services to another town, because the other town are not union members, and the goal of a union is to represent union members. So if we look at the combination of the budget and collective bargaining, we'd be looking for positions if and when we can fill them all.
Yeah, I think it's not necessarily, you know, replacing Richmond officers with Hinesburg officers. It's having the management rights to assign the work and the job descriptions and what those job descriptions for the officers are.
So if I were to answer that question in the near term, that's a function of the existing collective bargaining agreement and personnel policies, right? Which give a fair degree of latitude to management, I think. And I can't speak to future collective bargaining until that agreement is finalized.
Right, yeah. I was kind of making a statement.
Yeah.
I'm not asking a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, 'cause I think in an ideal situation, we would be able to use the resources of both towns, meaning, the officers to provide the coverage that both town
Right.
wants.
Together, we can do more than the departments, separately.
Right.
We take turns, we have two officers. We have an officer in each town and a third person floating between them on a given shift. That's hypothetical.
Hypothetical,
Yeah.
in any variation of that, yeah,
Right.
it would be, not just relying on the officers within our own boundaries
Right.
to provide service and respond. Yeah.
I think that's a really good question, just to be overt as one member of the select board, one member of this group and one member of collective bargaining. I agree that the principle should be, we should have flexibility for the collaboration between the two towns.
Yeah, I think sort of my perspective is, officer safety is really important. And as long as the officers are given the hours that they're required to be given in the contract, why not have more help?
Right. And there are a lot of little things like, when we have a road race and they contract with us to provide coverage for, keep cars from blazing right through the race. Invariably people ask, well, what about coverage for the rest of us who are not involved in the race? And it's nice to know that should Hinesburg have a race and needs to deploy an officer there, that the other that we can pick up the load during the time the race is going on. A lot of little things like that.
So what I'm hearing is that this is really more about management. I mean, instead of the working out the nitty gritty details of staffing, we're talking about sharing management of.
Right now with Anthony being chair, both our town's chief. He needs to be able to manage the personnel almost as though they were one department. And that's the subject that we have to bargain with our union to some extent. But that's, if we have two chiefs and one chief is calling up to say, so what coverage can you provide? The other one's saying this, and it's like every week they have to make that call. That's not efficient. So having one chief that over both, is part of what makes it work.
So I don't know if you are familiar with the public safety study that finally got done and got shared with us.
We were waiting with bated breath. I don't think.
No, we were.
No, we actually came up all the time. We were always,
It really, had been waiting for it for a long time.
Yeah, so there was a lot of attention to the police department because that was one of the main reasons that we undertook this study. And there were a lot of questions about how many police officers do we need? And it was, I don't know if you saw this information, but they came at it from several different angles, which was maybe helpful, maybe confusing. And they ended up saying, yeah, we've got a good number for our needs. And people asked specifically, do we have enough officers in Hinesburg to cover Richmond as well? And Paul, who was presenting the study, did some math about, well, this is how many hours these officers need and to cover this much territory. Yes, we do have enough with the officers that we have. It's enough for Hinesburg and Richmond. So I don't know how, if you guys hire your own officers, I don't know how that fits in with that picture.
Well, I think we'd be looking at, first it's like what officers are able to do what, and then how do we deploy those resources? I don't think it will be too difficult. It's possible. We have the one position that we know is temporary, based on the current arrangement where we're providing pretty much all the coverage. Once that changes, that position will have to go away.
Right.
So we'll be down to 5.
So another question is, when 4th of July happened last year, I think I had people visiting and we came to Richmond.
Your fireworks, there was a little problem.
Yep, and we saw the Hinesburg police
Mhm.
cars, and it was my grandchildren, and they said, look, there's Hinesburg police cars here in Richmond. How's that? And I explained it, but it made me think, would we have been able to provide coverage for both towns? Because hopefully this year we will have.
Well, I'm on the July 4th committee, and that was a big concern leading up to the day because I'm pretty paranoid where pedestrians, alcohol, and cars interact. We had an emergency training done by the AOT to train a bunch of us to be legal flaggers and so forth, so that we can actually stop traffic. And it was a godsend to have the police be available because we sort of kind of knew what we were doing, but people don't obey us as easily as they do somebody with a badge and a gun and all that. So your misfortune was to our benefit, but we're sorry it happened.
So my question is, if this year both towns
Have
have
fireworks.
fireworks, can police cover both towns?
Well, I think the thing we need to do is schedule sunset at different times.
Good idea.
Yeah, that's interesting.
No, obviously not. It's like the people who've asked us to reschedule the eclipse because it's happening at an inconvenient time. So I think they're joking. I hope they are. But yeah, it's a valid point. Do we have enough? If we're able to hire some, and we hope we will, then the question is we hope the answer would be yes. If we don't hire people, we hope won't be the case, it will be hard.
So part of this is about the hiring. It's not lost on any of us that many of the police departments in the state are understaffed, right?
Mhm.
Vacancies. We're probably with 3 technical vacancies. We don't have the largest number of vacancies in the state, but as 75% vacancy, that's probably the highest percentage in the state. And it's not lost on us. This comes up at town meeting occasionally. For many years, the town of Richmond got by with a single police officer. So what's the right number of police officers? In my opinion, early on in my career came to conclude it depends what the taxpayers want to pay for.
Right. Do they want to pay for 24-hour coverage? That comes up from time to time. There's not been a huge groundswell for it, but there are people who would like to see that.
So this 4th of July issue makes me think that the reason it works for Hinesburg police to cover Richmond is that's not common at all, that there's a conflicting need. There aren't that many calls, and so
Right.
our officers, when there's a call in Richmond, they're not usually having to respond to a call in Hinesburg.
I guess I'd like to hear what the reality of that is from Chief Cambridge, knowing that like the study's all well and good, but it sounds like from when I talked to you, your officers do feel a bit stretched thin trying to cover both towns with the current staffing levels.
Yes, so talking about one officer, go back 10 years, maybe even 5 years, there was no jobs to be had in policing, and you'd be on a waiting list, and it was a big process to get a job, especially if you went back 15 years. Now, the officers are sort of looking at the job differently. One of the things is pay. Another thing is, why am I working alone here when I could be in the town over making $2 more working with someone? So a lot of the things that made sense a few years ago quickly don't make sense. And they're very aware. They're constantly being. I mean, I have chiefs calling my officers, which annoys me. It's you could at least have an officer call. Like, that's how desperate people are in surrounding agencies. And so stretching them, my officers have gone along great. There's really hasn't been complaints, but I know that stretching them, because they're constantly like, well, this is for the greater good of the towns. We really like Richmond. We really want to do this. But they definitely want to see a light at the end of the tunnel of, okay, stuff's going to kind of go back to normal a little bit. Again, people working in Hinesburg and Richmond also, there's a quality of life for the officer. There's a reason people, if they wanted case to case to case working by, there'd be other departments they would pick. So we have to maintain that, that sort of that culture and that level of service. if we're not hitting that perfect spot of officer to town ratio, at some point, people are gonna be like, okay, I don't have enough time to stop at the store and say hi and community police, this isn't what I want. So we're not there right now, but we just need to be really careful that we don't stretch the officers too thin.
Well, the next few months are gonna be hard because Andrew's in the, so we're down, we're down to 5.
Like right now,
Yeah.
yeah, I have 3 on this. I got Brett's on vacation. These were planned. What's his name?
Nick.
Andrew's in the academy. Nick is also scheduled vacation. And so we're stretched then. Well, all of us have been working by ourselves this week. I'm on by myself tomorrow. Jeremy's on by himself on Saturday, and they've also been covering both towns where if they need backup, I'm coming from home. And that's sort of another thing of that was another thing that I had that I don't have now. I had a lot of officers that live very close. They all live within 30 minutes, but that's just not close enough. It's not, I could be in either village in a couple of minutes. And again, that's something that's changed in the last few years for us at least.
Have you had issues where you've been up against overtime limits because of availability and things that have come up?
I've never had any significant amount of overtime for the Hinesburg Police Department. I noticed that over the years that Richmond would budget 23. I think once there was 50,000 in overtime, and ours has been steady around 10, if that, and that was with call outs. Our overtime has been going up now because I sort of weigh, okay, do I want to leave one person on with 2 towns? I'd rather have say, hey, do you guys want some hours? Well, because we need to cover Richmond. So my overtime is because of the contract. I've been giving overtime, which if you have the adequate staffing and somebody that's capable of making the schedule that knows what they're doing, you're not going to have overtime. It's just overtime comes when there's not enough officers and there's bad scheduling. Right now, it's a little different again because we're technically understaffed because we're covering 2 towns. So you're going to see a little bit of raise in overtime.
So I have a follow-up question, and I think this relates to sort of capacity, and I think it's a question for you, Josh, where, with vacant positions, we've got one person who's on a military deployment, so a filled position, but essentially not available, right, for a very long period of time. And that situation is what it is. But for the remaining positions, Josh, any update on our hiring pipeline or process in terms of candidates in the?
No, we're working on the background check for one officer right now, and I think we've got 2 interviews maybe lined up
We're gonna
next
work-
week.
Yeah, we're going to schedule another interview as well.
Okay, so that'd be 3 interviews then for next week or so.
Thanks.
And that's,
And one candidate that we did interview actually did wash out of the process.
But the one that we're waiting on, I'm not a personnel expert, but I had a good feeling about him.
so when I, use a fishing metaphor, fish in the water is not equivalent to a fish on the line, but at least there's fish in the water, which is better than I can't see any fish.
It'd be helpful now if Richmond had an officer or 2, certainly.
Yeah. So that is our intent. That's what we've discussed at select board. It's what we've represented to the union. We are actively recruiting and hoping to fill vacant positions.
Right, and that's something that I guess needs to be reiterated from time to time. There are some people who feel that we're not trying because we're just happy with the status quo. The status quo is working, but stretched, and we'll all be happier when we're fully staffed both ways. I mean, just because you haven't needed a parachute yet doesn't mean that the plane won't have problems one day. You want to make sure you're covered.
And how many officers would it take to be fully staffed?
Well, we have funding for 1 chief position and 4 officers. So right now, if we hire 3 people, we would technically be fully staffed. Technically, because one guy's on military leave.
I see, okay, thank you.
And a subtlety of that is with 4 filled positions, 1 on military leave, we would still have, while the position is not vacant, we would have salary savings, which are available for other uses, including contract services with Hinesburg. That's just an oddity of a position that's filled but not actually providing.
So he's on military leave, he's not getting paid?
Right.
by the town?
Correct.
Oh, that's good.
So what would you anticipate your hours of staffing at for full time?
This is a question I always defer to the chief, like, what's our shift coverage?
We were like, what, 10 a.m. to 10 p.m., I think, when you guys started to get involved.
Oh,
Or-
you're talking about before we started, what your hours were?
Yeah, I think, or was it maybe 8 a.m. to 10 p.m., I think is what we strove for coverage.
We tried to figure it out and they were just kind of working sort of these weird 12-hour shifts. And now there's hours of operation. When we get an admin, Richmond or Hinesburg, we can actually have also office hours where we could say, hey, the office is open between 9 and 1 or something like that. Which is sort of more important in Richmond because there's no there's not really that walk-in lobby type where we have an open. We can pick up the phone and dispatch is on and the officer's there in a couple minutes. This process a little longer here.
But the question of shift coverage is something that's come up occasionally over time in town meeting and elsewhere. Well, why don't we have 24/7 coverage? Well, you start to do the math, how many officer positions you need to do that. And is that for single coverage or double coverage? Because you quickly escalate the number of officers.
Oh, yeah, the overnight shift is very expensive.
Yep. Yeah, we've been through that in Hinesburg.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I mean, we've had it very good. It was the way the arrangement was. But I don't think you'll see officers willing to do that again.
Right.
I remember looking at it, maybe when Chief Kapitansky was serving at a select board meeting where he ran some scenarios and some numbers to look at what it would cost, and ultimately we decided not to pursue it. And I think part of that was cost, but also the number of calls that actually come in overnight is relatively low. People have this fear, but when you look at the numbers, it's like a couple calls a week. And usually they're not.
Urgent.
Urgent, yeah.
The VSP is not happy about covering us during those times, except when it's a matter of life and limb, and then they are. Would they be there in 5 minutes? No. But would they be there? So far, we've gotten lucky. Most likely. Yeah.
Depending on what the circumstances are.
Right.
So, and what the triage is, but if there's active shooting going on, people will show up. If it's breaking in a garage.
You'd be surprised at the type of calls they will reject. I mean, I've been on the phone, on a Saturday where there's 2 people fighting and fighting over a child and if police don't show up, I'm gonna do this. State police, we're not coming till they do it. So there's definitely a threshold that there really has to be something.
That's worrisome.
I really think that everybody was waiting for the survey. I believe that the lowest possible number for the hours that we're doing now is, I'd like to see 9 in a chief, but I think it's 8 in a chief. 4 officers Hinesburg, 4 officers in Richmond. Can we do it with less? Yes, but again, quality of life. So I think that's where we should be. 8 and half a chief on each side. Now that also, with that many people, you're going to lose people. Hinesburg loses a person for 6 months. Richmond, now you're back down to 7, 6. So,
And then the next pandemic comes along.
So, right, it's an obvious truth that in a lot of staffing patterns, including police, that you're rarely 100% full all the time. It's almost like there's baked-in vacancies where you're understaffed, leaving aside vacations and sick leave and stuff. So
I try to always have somebody there ready to come in, but it's not, the ability to do that will lessen with the more staff we have.
And right
And-
now, you were the pinch hitter in a lot of cases that your quality of life, you'd probably just as soon not always be the guy on dinner.
Yeah, so one of the things that's also changed for me is on-call response time has changed about 2 years ago, but also just admin time doing stuff is has gone up to the point where I'm not pulling cars over anymore. I'm not in the community like I'd like to be. So that's sort of what I've noticed now is that I there's a point where I don't want to lose my connection with the communities either because I'm constantly stuck.
Right.
You know, so
At our last meeting of this, we talked about the part-time person we have. Would she be willing to take on more hours? The understanding I have is that she is not.
No, and she's actually reducing her hours and she's retiring in a few months.
Okay,
So,
so
and
that pretty much settles it.
Step forward, 2 steps back.
yeah, we chatted with her a couple weeks ago about kind of wrapping things up, and I think at that point you said you had maybe an idea or two of some people that we could bring in for interviews to fill that position. So we need to
Good.
pursue that.
How many hours are you thinking for admin?
So I think our admin right now is
16.
budgeted for about 15 a week. She was actually only ever working about 10 recently, but in the budget, we have 15, so
Okay.
we could just
What-
do that.
when I took over as chief, we had 5 officers and a 25-hour week admin. And I remember thinking, wow, we need more admin hours. And now it's like anything.
Well, because you had an admin and a volunteer, right?
And we had Doug
Right.
Olofsson that,
Yeah.
hey, I need stats on this. And it was like 2 minutes later, here you go. Now it's me, yesterday I was printing stats for Richmond. Took a good portion of the day.
Right. It seemed to me that it would possibly make sense to just, because there's always admin work. There's never not going to be admin work. If we take 20 hours, we pay for 20 hours, Hinesburg pays for 20 hours. We've got a full-time admin person who supports both towns. To me, that seems reasonable, but what do you guys think?
So your position is in the budget. We don't have anything.
Actually, what's interesting is, even though the budget year we're in was built on having 5 full-time officers and, some part-time spots. And we added a 6th full-time officer. Where the salary line item is right where it should be,
Financially.
Yes, obviously you can't say we'll pay 20 hours when it's on the budget, but
Yeah, we would have capacity now.
It's also because I haven't really had, I keep stealing my part-timers to put them into full-time slots. So I'm way down on part-timers right now.
So this is, there are a couple areas that this perhaps segues into medium to long range. Like, it seems clear to me from the beginning conversation of regionalization, like at Regional Planning Commission, there are economies of scale. And it includes chief services, it includes potentially admin support services that shared across towns maybe makes more sense. And then in terms of police coverage, the shift, if you looked at the 2 towns as a collaborative, what's the right shift pattern, whether it's backup or hours or whatever, fully staffed, we'd have a different conversation than we're able to have today, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the chief thing, I think is pretty easy. I would imagine. Let's say Richmond gets to. Like, once Richmond gets to 2 officers, I think it would make sense to sit down again and talk about coverage, because I could see. If you get 1 officer, you're still gonna need help from Hinesburg. 2 officers, you're likely still gonna need some coverage from Hinesburg. It's like, I think when you get to the 3, that, that's probably gonna reduce some. So we could almost kind of continue with the contract that we have for general police services into the next fiscal year. And then when, the circumstances change, we figure out, what's the next step. Because I don't think you're gonna have, 3 officers in a month.
That seems unlikely, given the empirical evidence today. And then if I just think the admin position, there, you know, there are different ways of doing this depending on the hours. What's the supply and demand? Because we say the demand, but if we don't have the supply, it doesn't work. One thing we did at one point is we had sort of a position that was split between Richmond and another town in zoning, but it was essentially a half-time position there. To create a 40-hour position, you have two different employers.
Yeah.
So there's different hybrids here. You have two different employers to make a job, or you have one job and you contract it out.
How did we handle his like health?
Health insurance, that'd be.
Was that Mitch?
So that was part of the problem with
Yeah.
the zoning was that she, actually, no, she got health insurance from, is it Hinesburg or Huntington that we shared Suzanne with? It was Hinesburg. Yeah, so that was maybe before you, when you were still up north there, right? So, but I think Hinesburg, she had benefits through Hinesburg, so she ended up getting like a $5 check every week through Hinesburg because of the benefits, and then a full check. It was challenging, but I think the way we do it with the chief is better. One town employs the officer in a contractual basis, and we split the cost.
It works better because of the anomaly in the United States of how benefits are accrued, right?
And I think, you know, given the way things are now, if Anthony were to find someone, I think there would likely be, in Hinesburg, we would hire them and then we would just make that into the contract too, but.
Mhm.
Yeah, and right now we could cover an admin out of the, unless we hire somebody very shortly, we've got budgeted money.
So the idea of the unified in the future, of, as you were referring to, having the two towns in one unified district. I think that's gonna have a lot of difficulties. I think there are gonna be a lot of
Right.
barriers to overcome.
Right.
And so I'm really happy with staying with the kind of contract and the partnership we have now as long as possible.
Right. At the last meeting, I think we realized that so long as we have a contractual relationship that I don't like the pulling out the rug aspect of at the end of it this year, everything could just go up in the air. I like a longer term contract, but I don't think that there's really that much advantage to going with the union district compared to the difficulties it would solve. The recent media coverage misstated things in the sense that they said merged district, and that's not really on the table right now. But
No, and I said that to her over and over and over and over and over and over.
yeah. Well, we've had experience with the media during our fluoride debacle. We eventually just realized the easiest way to not be misquoted is to say absolutely nothing.
To say nothing, yes. Well, it came from I think the newspaper article where the headline was merger on that. I was like, maybe come to the meetings and call someone as a reporter. You might get the right headline.
Yeah, I like the idea right now of sharing a chief seems to work well in terms of if we actually did have two separate chiefs, there would be, that's just
That would
awkward.
not work at all.
Yeah, sharing an admin, I think, again, if one town employed the admin and the other town contributed half the salary and benefits, I think that would work well. I would like to see an admin position filled because of the obvious limitation. It affects the patrolling if the chief is always doing admin.
Yep.
And there's always plenty of admin stuff to do. Things like reports, and we want it when our citizens say, so what actually did get done last month, and it knocks out a whole day of his. That's not efficient. So if we could find a candidate for a 30 to 40 hour admin position, I don't think there'd be a lot of argument on this end.
No, and I think this is sort of the layers of, do we continue with this sort of collaboration, which is somewhat ad hoc, and it's going to be year to year and depending on staffing and all that stuff. It's not lost on any of us that a new municipal district for the purpose of policing with charter, governance, budget, that is a 2 to 3 year project. There are pros and cons to both, is how I see it. And you go through what are the pros and cons. If you're on a select board and you create this new thing, there is ostensibly a loss of control and authority. It's like Chittenden Solid Waste District. You do not control the Chittenden Solid Waste District, nor do I, but we are all members.
Well, it's also like the change in the supervisory unions.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
School districts. You used to have your local school board, and now you've got, 2 people maybe on the entire
Yeah.
school board for the
So I think eyes open, as somebody who's also been not a close student, but a spectator of regional dispatch. And I don't know how closely you followed that. People have talked about regionalization for, seriously, if you look at the roots, it's like 50 years. It's that old. And to date, it seems like nobody's really achieved it.
I've never understood why dispatch has been so insane.
All of the same reasons,
Yeah.
control,
Control,
authority, money.
Over the person who answers the phone and tells the cops where to go.
It's a revenue generator.
But let's just say one dispatch area is unionized by one union and the other has no unions. So what are you going to do with non-union group of employees and a union group of employees when you try to throw them together? What are you going to do with two different directors? Like, you can't have two different directors of a single organization. There are lots of individual reasons why individual people would say no. Even if at a very abstract conceptual level, everyone tends to say, yeah, that makes sense. And it would make sense if you were starting from scratch. But once you have existing infrastructure with existing sort of constituencies, it becomes much more difficult to change. At least that's how it looks.
Oh, yeah, I'd agree. And, to me, it sounds like for the second thing on the agenda, seems that the discussion we have would mean that probably, from my perspective, isn't something we would need to endeavor right now.
Yeah, we seem to be all singing the same tune right now.
Right, yeah. I mean, I think that would come, in maybe 2 years, you're like, okay, this is going well. Maybe we want to change the structure or something that we might endeavor, something like that, but I don't.
Perhaps when I think about it, you leave it on the shelf, you take it off, you look at it, you put it back. This might not be the right time or have advantages.
Right.
If you weigh our current state to that potential state. And to your points earlier, getting to that state is itself an investment of time. There are legal issues, financial issues. It would be investment of time and money to get to that destination. So presumably one should be confident that the return outweighs the investment, that there's a benefit to doing that.
Would there ever be a, speaking of economies of scale in terms of capital expenses? Are officers taking the cars home?
Well, I back up and say, if we put aside the red herring of officers taking cars home and say, how many officers do you need? How many buildings do you need? What's the hierarchy infrastructure? How many cruisers do you need? Because you might ostensibly need fewer cruisers across a single department than two independent departments, but that's something I defer to the chief on. When I think about equipment and inventory and policies, there are economies of scale to that potentially. But then you give up authority to do that. If it were one single entity that neither one of us truly owns, then it is like the supervisory union, and pros and cons.
There's a lot of things to think about when it comes to the things like that, but specifically police cars, like right now. It makes sense for Richmond to have take homes. Or to, I can fit some in Hinesburg, but to get them out of a parked area, not just because of public.
Open, that's just.
Also because, the process of stripping out the guns, doing all that, but also leaving a marked police car overnight it's the same thing with us. We have a really big garage, but we also need that because we don't have, most new police departments that are built have like kind of fenced backyard, where if you're not 24/7, you lock it in the gate. We don't have that. So I have to make sure that either somebody's taking a car home to not leave it there, or making sure that they're all in the garage so that they're taken care of. So there's really a lot more that goes into it than just, do we give them a take home or not?
The other obstacle that I think needs to be recognized, when we take that big box off the shelf and look at the unified district in the future, you might have noticed how reluctant towns are in Vermont to give up their little schools. It's really difficult, and I think it would be more so with towns giving up their individual police departments.
I don't know. I think that the schools, like, I think about Starksboro. I mean, that's like they only have 3, community buildings, and that's a huge one. So I think it's a gathering place as well.
I think those
Conversation-
parallel issues, but I agree. I think schools are a way bigger deal
Right,
than what badge is on the shoulder.
right. The conversation has changed a little bit with the Vermont State Police no longer willing to contract for coverage. Now people who want to make sure they're covered, they realize it's going to have to be a local thing. But I grew up in Virginia, and in Virginia, everything is done at the county level. We have county school systems, we have county cops. Well, we do have police as well, but the sheriff does a lot of actual law enforcement and not just security at construction projects. And so it was a little odd to me to be told that they would rather maintain Brewster Pierce Elementary with 20 students sometimes, because that way they can walk to school, even if it means that they're getting a lower quality education because you're paying for bare bones. I just can't wrap my brain around that, but Vermonters, that's just how things are. So with police, I kind of agree with Barr that so long as people know that there's somebody who will come if they pick up the phone. I haven't heard a lot of people saying it has to have that person has to have a Richmond badge on the shoulder.
My experience, both personal experience and talking to friends and neighbors, is that in the beginning, it's jarring. There is a certain number of people, percentage of people, like, how come it doesn't say Richmond on the side? Or why is Hinesburg here versus Richmond? My thesis is that's a pretty small number in percent. Most other people are happy to see a police officer like pulling over a speeder. I don't care where they're from. And then if they're polite or are walking down the street and have a conversation, my experience is that gets a lot more like recognition than who's driving a car around or sitting in a car on Route 2 trolling for speeders.
I've noticed as we've moved forward over the past year that Richmond and Hinesburg, there's been, especially more on the Richmond side, there's been ownership taken of Hinesburg, and it's like they're okay here because they're Hinesburg, and it's also, I think people have gotten used to, okay, there's a Richmond police car in front of our police department. That's normal. It's really has over the past year become something that both towns, people in the towns have sort of, we're okay with this, which I thought was going to take a lot longer.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why that's the case is because population wise and in other respects, our towns are fairly similar. If either one of us was in a relationship with Williston, we would always feel like the tail and they would be the dog. And people, I think, would complain about that. Even if they're getting the exact same quality of coverage, they just don't want to be a junior partner. As equal partners, people don't mind that.
I think what would be helpful after town meeting is for Josh, Anthony, and I to sit down and kind of lay out a plan of like, okay, when Richmond gets 1 officer, this is how we see things work. And when Richmond gets 2, this is how we see 3 things working. And then when they get 3, here's kind of how we see it working. So we all understand what it will look like. Because like I said, I think when we have 2, we'll still need some help from Richmond. Then once you get to 3, maybe depending on how your negotiations go or what have you, it might be a more back and forth than, just a Hinesburg providing.
And I would like to at some point, I don't know what has to happen, but to pursue the idea of hiring for a joint admin position.
Oh, yeah. I guess,
Yeah.
see that's
Yeah, okay,
Mechanical.
low hanging fruit.
sure, okay.
And I think the idea in my head, I started to think about, well, so if we had 1 or 2 or 3, what would the shift patterns look like? And the shift patterns arguably should be informed by what are the data about frequency and severity of calls, like what do we want to cover? And then what's left uncovered, or when do we want backup versus when are we not going to have backup?
So that's something that I saw Richmond sort of, there was two ways that they were doing it. It was like, this is kind of when people want us here. It's like, this is kind of when it work. And then there was a lot of holes, and state police, they were very confused as to when they were supposed to be here or not. And they were, constantly looking on the screen, it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon or somebody. And I am adamant that we have hours of operation. We're here 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. I'm on by myself tomorrow. But I'm not gonna say, hey, I have to go to a meeting somewhere and I'm gonna leave the town to state police. It's never gonna happen. We're gonna cover those hours, 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. tomorrow. And that's how I will continue with when the department grows with Richmond. So, because bad things happen at any time of the day or night. So,
Mhm.
Good.
So, are we at sort of next steps, like, and to the low hanging fruit, because I think you're right, the admin position is similar to a chief. That's probably pretty straightforward. You're not worried so much about shift coverage and days, like. So should we ponder that, or is that something we sort of ask Todd and Josh to
Hash out.
hash out?
Yeah, we can do that. Like, I don't think might be harder finding someone to fill the position than.
Well, Josh, how old are your kids again?
You're pretty computer savvy, mate.
They're getting to be more so than me.
Because, yeah, I don't need to get into the weeds on that, but it's like hiring and getting people
Right.
on board, and then what does it look like? And if our model is kind of ad hoc collaboration, it kind of depends on who shows up as candidates.
Mhm.
We might put it out for, let's start with, how many hours do we want to put it out for? Are we looking for full-time, 30 hours, 32 hours? Like,
Well, do we-
there could be a threshold for insurance coverage, right?
Right, that's the thing, is what's the threshold for that?
Yeah, it's funny, some people are looking for full-time work, some people are retirees and they only want to work part-time and they don't care about health insurance. They want to
Yeah.
work 24 hours.
Okay,
But
Mhm.
I've started this strategy of just advertising a position as full-time and part-time, because you just never know
Who
who
you
you're
gonna
gonna
get?
get.
Back to fishing,
Mhm.
Yeah.
two
but-
lines in the water.
But yeah, well, Josh, Anthony and I can talk about that. We'll figure it out. And then I think beyond that, I said this is, assuming how meeting happens and budgets passed, then kind of laying out what it.
right, and if we do get,
Cool.
if we do get staffed and you guys stay staffed, at some point, I think it's reasonable to look at, extend the contract beyond an annual renewal.
Yeah.
Because I think it makes it easier on both sides to know that there's stability.
Well, yeah, and I think that will be easy to do. Once we know what it looks like when, you're fully staffed and we're fully staffed, and sort of what services are going back and forth.
Let me ask you a potential future state question. This seems like with unbridled optimism, given the current state. But in some future state, if we have more staff here and there's a collaboration, we're more fluid about shift coverage. How do people in Hinesburg react if a police cruiser shows up with a Richmond police officer in it to respond to a call in Hinesburg?
Throwing eggs, spray paint, that kind of thing. For sure.
No, I mean, I think I would like that to get to a point where that can happen, because I think
That's why I posed the question,
Yeah.
because I think that's sort of an unstated future state, but we should be clear about if that's where we're going, what are.
yeah, no, I guess I haven't stated it very clearly, but that's what I imagined. That's what I said, once you're fully staffed and you see what services are going back and forth.
Yeah, and it's not
To
completely
use an
impressive.
analogy, there are still people in Hinesburg that wish we had our own ambulance, but it's much more efficient and cost effective for us to contract with Richmond Rescue. I haven't heard of anybody where the Richmond Rescue ambulance comes and somebody says, oh, no, I don't want that ambulance. I want our Hinesburg ambulance.
Yeah, I
No,
think-
and it's not unprecedented to have the police, like, I've seen Williston cops stopping people in Richmond. It's just because it's cross coverage, and I don't think the person getting the ticket particularly cares who's writing it to them, but, in Vermont, there's enough. Hand washes the other, that I don't
Well,
think.
yeah,
Yeah.
when the state trooper responds, he's most likely not from your town, so like.
Right.
responding to calls, I think what I've gotten from Hinesburg people is, oh, hey, how's that contract working out? Like when they see the Richmond car. And I haven't gotten any negative from Hinesburg people.
I think it's the, how they're treated by the officer.
Right, absolutely.
That's been my experience on this side. And
And no
there's
complaints on that score, yeah.
no, in fact, now I know complaints. I've gotten unsolicited positive feedback, which is not a very common experience. How often on the select board does somebody stop in and say, I just want to say how well this is going?
Yeah, how many times do you see that from Ports Forum?
Someday.
So once everything is settled, and this is why I think it's really important to have, I keep stressing hours of operation, because it's sort of a marker, as to where you are and where you need to go. And things are getting worse, and there are a lot of people, I think in both towns, certainly in Hinesburg, that say, there's this marker at 11 o'clock, like careful, you have police until 11. And there's a lot of things going on in the middle of the night in both towns, and this is the most change this year that I've ever seen. And we really need to be prepared that once we get the towns where they need to be, we start thinking about, do we need to go to 12 o'clock, or do we need to go to 1 o'clock, or, hey, we've seen 2 years of this many officers. Do we need to add one, or, whatever it is?
Sure.
Because things are changing, and I didn't think it was gonna happen this fast. I've been talking about it for a long time, but this is it. It's here. Stolen cars, and it's been really crazy.
So it seems to me that is the kind of thing, as we engage in a discussion of what coverage do we want to be data informed by, what coverage are we being asked to provide, when are calls coming in about what, and to have that help inform our shift coverage, right?
With what the towns are willing, or what the taxpayers are willing to.
Within
pay
the
for.
constraints of that, this is stuff that, evolves slowly.
Yes.
I mean, we have 4 and a chief now, and I'm saying 30 or 40 years ago, we had 1, 50 years ago, whatever it was.
And we sometimes issued them bullets, right?
So
It's the Barney Fife reference.
it didn't change overnight. That was an evolution in both approach and budget. So recognize anything we do is changing year to year, not day to day.
And there will always, there are certain people in our town who hear about community policing and say, I live out on Robbins Mountain Road. Them walking around the neighborhood doesn't help me at all. If I have a problem, I'm responding with my own gun. There will always be people like that.
Yes.
You're not going to please everyone.
Right, yeah. That's very true.
That's an actual quote.
I'm not surprised.
Well, and there's another actual quote, and this is where it was different, that so a citizen was observing that some number of years ago, their perception of the Richmond police were parked on Route 2. And I can tell you the 2 or 3 places they parked looking for speeders, and people would see them there over and over and over in a car. And so the idea that the officers would be outside of their car walking around was itself kind of refreshing to some of our citizens, and would engage in a conversation. I will say I had this personal experience where I went up to a vehicle. This is some number of years ago. The engine's running, the officer is in there, with the radar on. And it took about a minute and a half for them to open the window to acknowledge my presence. And this is right in town. That is not the interaction that our citizens hope for. And that is not the interaction that our experiences have described, the experience they've had with Hinesburg officers. And so that's where I go to this thesis of, it's not about the decal or the shoulder badge, it's about the interaction.
So customer service matters even in law enforcement. Who knew?
Sure does.
So get on that sidewalk.
The officers take on the sort of a little bit the personality of the chief, and that's something I learned when the department sort of shifted to my sort of attitude, my style. And so it's funny hearing that, because I've had that conversation with you before, but yeah.
I remember suggesting to a former chief that, it'd be nice if you guys walked around a little bit, stopped in stores, and he said, no, people want us in the cars,
Well, you
feeders.
hear the warrior mentality, the guardian mentality. When I hear people saying things like that, I think I know which side they're coming down on. the same side as the people who want to get all that Army surplus equipment. They don't want to get close to the citizenry. They want to be the tough guys. And, you know, that's not what Richmond wants, obviously. We want people who we feel like we know.
Well, so anyway, I think it's going well. We have sort of some plans to continue down this path. And I think it probably behooves us to have some intermittent meetings to talk about an ongoing collaboration, like how's it going, check in. Beyond, a lot of it, I think, will be devolved or delegated to the three of you, like work it out, but big picture for us occasionally to come together to say, how's it going?
Yeah, I think the next meeting would make sense would be that sort of roadmap that I was talking about us creating.
Cool.
Mhm.
And that would be sort of the shift in the coverage and officers, but also we could have, as it makes sense, the admin update, like what's the
Yeah.
plan? I appreciate the idea of advertise either full-time, part-time, negotiable, or two different ads, however you cast
See what
them
you
like
get,
that.
sure.
Yeah, makes sense.
Cool. Great. I'm gonna go let my dog out.
Oh, that's a good idea.
On the agenda was also the idea of a facilitator. Doesn't seem like we need that. at this
No,
point.
I don't.
I think my take was that's really about if we're pulling the box off the shelf, opening it up
yeah.
and pursue that.
Yeah.
I think this seems to be going well unless I think we're okay.
Yeah, I agree.
I think the task is to approach this as collaborative partners on an equal footing, and as long as we maintain that and open communication, I think we're good.
Yep.
And then we could return to the question in the future, like, is there a benefit of making a greater investment on this joint separate department, and what is the return that would justify that investment?
We'll bring out the champagne when we decide to invest in decals, you know, Hinesburg, Richmond-Hinesburg for the cars.
Okay. It sounds like we're pretty good at this point. Are people ready to adjourn?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Do we need a
Motion to adjourn, sure.
Second,
Okay, all in favor, please state your name and your vote.
Or I.
Say aye.
aye.
Josh, aye.
Okay, thank you all so much. And for those of you watching at home later, we hope this has been helpful to you as well.